When workers dug into the old church well in Saint Aurelia, Louisiana, they expected to find nothing more than mud. Instead, they found a single tiny shoe, still laced, floating in the stagnant water. What they pulled from that well silenced the entire parish, and was never spoken of again. The well water smelled of rust and old coins. The men who found it refused to speak on record, but one foreman later told his wife that the water was too warm for spring, and that he could hear faint crying echoing up from below, even before the bucket hit the surface. Within hours, federal agents appeared, too quickly for it to be coincidence. The well was sealed by nightfall, and the men who had been present were taken for questioning. Some never returned to work. The discovery was kept out of the local newspaper, though a single anonymous letter was published in New Orleans, claiming that the Saint Aurelia disappearances were about to resurface. Most Americans have never heard of Saint Aurelia. Its name was erased from most maps after 1952. But if you search hard enough, you will find fragments, court transcripts, censored reports, and a single priest's handwritten note. The bells rang again last night. The children must be ready. Saint Aurelia was founded in 1821 on the banks of a sugar-rich stretch of the Bayou Teche. The plantations thrived, their white columns casting long shadows over rows of enslaved laborers. The town grew quickly, a church, a schoolhouse, and eventually a 3-story orphanage meant to house children left behind by yellow fever and the war with Mexico. But the town was uneasy. Diaries from the time mentioned strange sounds at night, the ringing of bells when no one was in the church, the cries of children when none were missing. A midwife named Isabel Duclair wrote of faces in the fields after dusk, standing motionless among the cane. By the 1870s, Saint Aurelia was half empty. The Great Fire of 1871 had gutted the main street, leaving only blackened foundations. Locals whispered that the fire had been a mercy, that it burned out what was under there. Many residents packed up and left, heading north. What remained were ghosts, not literal ones, but a collective silence. Newcomers were warned not to go near the orphanage ruins. Children were told never to ring the church bell after dark. It was as though the entire town had agreed to forget, to bury its memory under sugar fields and swamp mud. And for a time it worked. Saint Aurelia faded from the maps. But not from history. The orphanage was built in 1854 by the Mission of Saint Aurelia, a Catholic order with funding from plantation wealth. At first glance, it was a place of charity. 3 stories of whitewashed wood, with a bell tower visible for miles. Local papers praised its discipline and order. But its reputation among the children was darker. Survivors' accounts describe rigid schedules, endless fasting, and nights spent locked in cold stone basements for even small disobedience. There were whispers of a room at the top of the bell tower, a room no one was ever allowed to see. A surviving letter from a child named Eloise M., dated 1859 reads, "Sister Agnes says we are to be made ready for the feast soon. She says Father Bernard is pleased with how many we have now. I am afraid because the last feast, Marie did not come back. The other girls said they saw her walking down the hall, but she would not speak." This letter was never sent. It was found decades later, stuffed into a crack in the wall when the orphanage was being repaired after the war. No records exist of what these feasts entailed. Parish ledgers show no evidence of any public ceremonies. But the disappearances began around this time. Children vanishing from their beds, their names quietly struck from the rolls. Between 1854 and 1862, at least 47 children are documented as having run away from the orphanage. That number comes from the orphanage's own records, which were later seized by state officials. Local newspapers reported the vanishings, but each article was oddly restrained, as though meant to avoid panic. Parents from nearby parishes stopped sending their children there. Yet the mission of Saint Aurelia kept receiving funding, kept receiving supplies, even as enrollment plummeted. In 1861, as the Civil War began, the disappearances abruptly stopped. The war provided a convenient distraction, and the orphanage was converted into a refuge for Confederate officers. But some of those officers wrote letters home describing strange noises at night, bells tolling, even though the tower was unmanned. Scratching sounds behind the walls, the sensation of being watched while they slept. One Confederate major was found dead in his quarters with symbols carved into his chest. The death was blamed on fever delirium, though no doctor was ever brought in to confirm it. Survivors of Saint Aurelia would later speak, in hushed tones, about the bells. They were said to ring at exactly midnight, though no one was seen pulling the rope. Children would lie awake, staring at the ceiling, knowing what the sound meant. The next morning, one of them would be gone. Sometimes their bedsheets were neatly folded. Sometimes the mattress was stained dark with something no one could name. The bells became a symbol of dread. Adults refused to talk about them, but in private diaries from the era, references appear again and again. The bells. God help us. One nun reportedly smashed the bell rope with an axe in 1860. The next night, the bells rang louder than ever, though the rope was still severed. The ringing continued until the Great Fire of 1871. After that night, the bells were never heard again, not until the well was uncovered in 1922. In 1863, after a violent flood tore through Saint Aurelia, a farmer dredging debris from the bayou found a small, leather-bound ledger sealed in wax. The cover bore no name, only a symbol. A circle surrounded by 7 marks that looked like children holding hands. Inside, the ledger contained pages of names, dozens of them, written in careful Latin script. Each name was followed by a date, and next to each date was a crude drawing. A circle, a cross, or a spiral. The final page contained only 3 words in Latin, Eti campani sonant, and the bells will ring. The ledger was turned over to the parish priest, Father Bellamy, who locked it away in the rectory. But word spread quickly. Farmers began to whisper that the ledger was not a record of baptisms, but of sacrifices, that each child's name was entered only after they had been chosen. Months later, Father Bellamy drowned in the bayou. His body was found with the ledger clutched to his chest, as though he had tried to destroy it. But the pages were still dry. The church sent replacements from New Orleans within days. The ledger was taken away, supposedly to the Archdiocese archives, and never seen again. The Civil War may have saved Saint Aurelia or cursed it. When Union troops approached the parish in 1863, the orphanage became a temporary headquarters for Confederate officers. The children were sent to nearby farms, though no one ever confirmed how many actually left. Letters from Confederate Captain Elijah Moore describe unrest in the orphanage at night. He complained of scratching in the walls, of hearing the voices of children in empty hallways, and of a bell ringing though the tower was unmanned. Within weeks, several officers were transferred out. One reportedly shot himself in the bell tower. His suicide note contained a single phrase, scrawled over and over, "The feast does not end." After the war, the orphanage resumed operations as though nothing had happened. Yet the town's population began to dwindle. People spoke of a shadow over the hill, and a generation of children grew up being told never to look at the tower after sunset. On a sweltering summer night in 1871, fire tore through the orphanage and half of Saint Aurelia's main street. Witnesses described seeing flames rising from the bell tower first, a white pillar of fire that lit the sky like daylight. Survivors said they heard the bells ringing as the building burned, ringing so violently that the sound rattled windows 2 miles away. Then suddenly silence. The official report blamed Union saboteurs, though no evidence was ever produced. Some townsfolk insisted the fire had come from within, that it was a purging. When the smoke cleared, no bodies were recovered. Not one. The sisters, the priests, the children, all gone. The only thing left standing was the bell tower itself, blackened but upright, its bell still hanging as though untouched. For years afterward, residents refused to rebuild on the hill. Many moved away entirely. The town entered a slow decline, as though the fire had burned out more than just wood and stone. In the decades after the fire, Saint Aurelia became a place of dread. Farmers who tried to till the land near the ruins reported tools breaking, animals refusing to enter the fields, and strange handprints appearing on their doors at night. Small, child-sized handprints. Midwives spoke of hearing crying near the ruins, even when no children were nearby. Hunters claimed to see pale figures running between the cane rows at dusk, too small and too fast to be grown men. By 1889, the parish had lost nearly half its population. Those who stayed avoided the hill entirely. A few brave souls tried to rebuild the orphanage as a schoolhouse, but every attempt ended in disaster. Collapsed scaffolding, sudden illness, even death. One carpenter reportedly went mad after a beam struck his head. He spent his final days carving small wooden bells and muttering, "The feast is not done, they still wait." Eventually, the ruins were left to rot. Cane grew over the foundation stones. The bell tower stood like a sentinel, its blackened shape a warning to anyone who passed. In 1908, state officials arrived in Saint Aurelia and declared the Orphanage Hill a restricted site. No explanation was given, except that digging or construction was forbidden under penalty of law. Locals were baffled, until word spread that a group of surveyors had unearthed a pit near the bell tower. Whatever they found was quickly covered up, and the men who had seen it were relocated out of parish jurisdiction. Rumors ran wild. Some said the pit contained bones. Others claimed the earth beneath the orphanage was hollow, filled with rooms no one had ever mapped. Old-timers began saying the ban was not to protect the living, but to protect the dead or whatever still lingered there. And then, in 1922, the well was discovered. The discovery of the well in 1922 was supposed to be routine. Construction crews were digging foundations for a new sugar refinery on the edge of the old orphanage grounds when they struck stone. Beneath the soil lay a perfectly circular stone ring, sealed with iron. When the workers pried it open, the air that rose from below was warm, damp, and smelled of iron and decay. At the bottom of the well, floating in water that seemed far too deep, was a single child's shoe, white, with its laces still tied. The men lowered a bucket and retrieved what they thought were bones of a small animal. But when they brought them up, one of the men swore they were tiny human ribs. He refused to return to work. Within hours, government agents appeared, arriving in black cars that had no markings. By nightfall, the well had been sealed with concrete. The site was declared off-limits. No official report was ever filed. That same week, 3 of the construction crew left town abruptly. One was later found dead in Baton Rouge, drowned in his bathtub. Local journalists tried to investigate the well incident, but their articles were never published. One young reporter, Samuel Pryor, submitted a detailed piece describing stacked bones and carved symbols in the well, only for it to be pulled hours before printing. Pryor disappeared a month later. His notebook was later found in a locked church confessional, its last entry reading, "They were not buried, they were stored." Court records from this period show that federal officials paid large sums to local families for silence agreements. Entire boxes of parish records from 1850 to 1871 vanished from the courthouse. Residents became fearful. The older generation warned the young not to speak of the orphanage at all. People said that the government wasn't just hiding a tragedy, they were hiding something still active beneath the hill. In 1930, Sister Catherine M., a former nun of the mission of Saint Aurelia, was found wandering the cane fields near Lafayette. She was frail, nearly blind, and muttering in a mix of French and Latin. When brought to a local hospital, she gave a fragmented confession to a parish priest, claiming the children had been given as offerings, and that the bells were summons, not warnings. She described a locked chamber beneath the orphanage where the children were taken one by one. "They told us it was holy work," she whispered, "but I heard them screaming. The feast was never for God." Hours later, Sister Catherine was dead. The official cause was heart failure, but hospital staff swore her face was frozen in terror when they found her. Her testimony was written down by the priest, but the document disappeared from diocesan archives within the year. 2 years later, during a routine audit, a hidden storage chest was discovered in the basement of the parish rectory. Inside were bills of sale from the 1850s, shipments of iron shackles, chloroform, and wooden crates labeled simply relics. One receipt was signed by a plantation owner named Henri Duval, known for his obsession with preserving bloodlines. Another bore the seal of a New Orleans shipping company with ties to Haiti, where voodoo rituals were feared by slaveholding elites. Historians now believe the mission of Saint Aurelia was not merely a religious refuge. It was a place where children were gathered, restrained, and prepared for something no church would ever admit. The symbols carved into the receipts matched those in the ledger found in 1863. Circles, spirals, and the bell motif repeated over and over, as though marking cycles, rituals that had to be completed. For 70 years after the fire, the bells of Saint Aurelia were silent. But in 1942, during World War II blackouts, residents of nearby parishes reported hearing faint ringing at midnight. The sound carried on the wind, low and metallic, like a bell underwater. Dogs howled. Chickens refused to roost. Some families claimed to see lights flickering on the hill where the bell tower once stood. 3 children vanished from their homes that summer. Their beds were found neatly made. No sign of forced entry. Local sheriffs organized search parties, but no trace of the children was ever found. The ringing continued for 3 nights. Then it stopped. One farmer swore he saw small footprints, barefoot, leading from his porch toward the ruins. He followed them until they vanished into the sugarcane. When he returned, he found a tiny wooden bell sitting on his doorstep. In 1949, a sugar field just outside Saint Aurelia collapsed after heavy rain, exposing what lay beneath. Workers found a mass grave containing the remains of over 60 children. Their skulls were arranged in concentric circles, each circle smaller than the last, forming a spiral that pointed toward the earth. At the center of the spiral was a single iron bell, half buried in the soil. It was small, no bigger than a man's fist, and inscribed with the same strange circle and mark symbols seen in the ledger and parish receipts. Authorities arrived within hours, sealed off the field, and removed the remains. The site was filled with fresh earth by morning. Witnesses who had seen the grave were interrogated and sworn to secrecy. One worker later claimed that when he picked up one of the skulls, he heard faint ringing in his ears, and that the ringing didn't stop until he smashed the skull back into the dirt. No official report was ever filed. The federal presence in Saint Aurelia intensified after the discovery. Black sedans patrolled the roads. The bell tower was finally demolished, its timbers burned in a pit and buried under concrete. Residents were told the entire area would be converted into a sugar refinery district. But instead, the land was fenced off and left empty. By the early 1950s, the town's population had dropped to almost nothing. Families moved away, claiming they could no longer sleep through the night. Some spoke of hearing children's laughter echoing through empty streets. Others claimed to see pale figures standing at the edge of the fields at dusk. A few refused to leave until they were found dead. The official causes ranged from accidents to heart attacks, but their bodies were always discovered facing the hill, as though they had been watching for something when they died. By the mid-1950s, descendants of Saint Aurelia's survivors began to exhibit disturbing symptoms. Night terrors, compulsive bell ringing, violent episodes, and even ritualistic self-harm were reported in multiple families. One doctor noted that many of the afflicted children drew spirals and bells over and over, unable to explain why. Several were institutionalized. A wave of suicides followed, concentrated among those who still lived near the ruins. Entire bloodlines vanished in a single generation. Psychologists studying the case concluded that the trauma had been passed down like a contagion. But there was something deeper, an almost magnetic pull toward the Orphanage hill, as though the descendants were being called back. By the 1970s, Saint Aurelia no longer appeared on road maps. The last standing building, the church rectory, collapsed in 1974. Locals stopped visiting entirely, leaving the place to rot under cane and swamp. In recent years, urban explorers have returned to the area. Drone footage shows strange patterns in the soil where the orphanage once stood, dark circles that appear only under certain light, as though the earth itself still remembers. Those who camp overnight report waking at exactly midnight to the sound of bells. Not loud, but distant, like metal ringing underwater. Some have recorded faint children's voices on their audio equipment, whispering words in French and Latin. Few stay for a second night. Historians digging into the Saint Aurelia archives have found chilling parallels in other states. Similar orphan disappearances occurred in Pennsylvania, New York, and Illinois between 1830 and 1890, always near Catholic missions, always with reports of bells ringing at night. Taken together, they form a network of forgotten tragedies or rituals, stretching across the country. The mission of Saint Aurelia was quietly dissolved by the church in the 1880s. No formal record of its dissolution exists. Its members were reassigned, their archives sealed. But the ledger found in 1863? It ended with a final page, torn but still legible. A single phrase in Latin, Cum campani iterum sunant, festum redibit. When the bells ring again, the feast will return. And for those who live near the ruins of Saint Aurelia, the bells have already begun to ring.